Good afternoon, and welcome to Following the Footsteps of the Disappeared. My name is Brandon Hamber, and I'm the John Hume and Thomas P. O'Neill Chair in Peace at Ulster University, and I'm going to be moderating the session this afternoon. But just once again, welcome to all of you for joining us for all over the world. Following the Footsteps of the Disappeared is a 3-year program which started in Chile in 2019. And it's incorporated seminars and textile displays to mark the International Day of the Victims of Enforced Disappearance, which is the 30th of August. And some of you were with us last year. We had a range of events in Northern Ireland, and these events will continue over the course of the coming year and will culminate in a seminar and exhibition in Mexico in August 2022. Following the Footsteps of the Disappeared is a partnership between Conflict Textiles, which houses nearly 400 conflict textiles in Apieras, Ulster Museum, and the John Hume and Thomas P. O'Neill Chair in Peace, myself at Ulster University, and also Cane, which houses the online collection of the textiles. The seminar today is going to be entitled Transitional Justice and the Disappeared of Northern Ireland. But I also just wanted to note that the seminar is sort of a continuation of some events which started this morning. We launched a new exhibition at Ulster Museum as part of the Troubles and Beyond display. I'll put up a link shortly to that. You can go and see that now physically, as well as connect with it online. So today is sort of a series of events, as the whole Following Footsteps of program has actually been. The title for today's seminar is Transitional Justice and the Disappeared of Northern Ireland. And our first speaker is Dr. Lauren Dempster, who is a lecturer in the School of Law at Queen's University, Belfast. Her research interests focus on transitional justice, including responses to disappearances, efforts to deal with the past in Northern Ireland, and the intersection of transitional justice and conflict-related environmental harm. Lauren's PhD research, which she conducted 2012 to 2016, explored the disappearances that were perpetrated during the Northern Ireland conflict through a transitional justice lens, and she has subsequently gone on to write a really fascinating and excellent book entitled Transitional Justice and the Disappeared in Northern Ireland, which was published by Routledge in 2019. So Lauren, you're very welcome. We have a respondent, Dr. Huhle, and I'll introduce Rena when he follows on from Lauren. So Lauren, you're very welcome, and we look forward to your input today.
Thank you, Brandon, and thank you also to Roberta and the Conflict Textiles team for inviting me to participate in today's event. So Roberta Bacic asked me to talk about my research on the disappearances that were perpetrated in Northern Ireland. Given that this event is linked to, as Brandon mentioned there, the launch of this new exhibition of conflict textiles in the Ulster Museum, I wanted to think about the connections between conflict textiles and the disappearances of Northern Ireland. And one key point of connection between the two is that both are about, a key factor in both is mobilisation by relatives of the disappeared. So that's what I'm going to focus on in today's presentation. So it's just one aspect of my research that I'm going to draw on today. So I'm going to say a little bit more about some of the textiles during my presentation, but Roberta, if you get your audio going, you might want to give some more detail afterwards, as obviously you know them a lot better than I do. So Alan, could you move on to the next slide, please? Okay, so I'm going to begin with a brief overview of the disappearances that were perpetrated in Northern Ireland for anyone who is unfamiliar. So 16 individuals disappeared in Northern Ireland between 1972 and 1985. And in the majority of those cases, the Provisional IRA has acknowledged responsibility. The INLA, which is a smaller Republican armed group, has admitted responsibility for one disappearance. And in several cases, no group has acknowledged responsibility, but Republican paramilitary groups are suspected to have been involved. So in 1999, the Independent Commission for the Location of Victims' Remains was established. And today I'll talk about the mobilisation by victims' families that led to its establishment. But the ICLVR was established via legislation passed by both the British and Irish parliaments. It operates on the basis of a limited immunity mechanism, so information given to the Commission can only be used for the purposes of locating remains. The information can't be used in prosecution. The Commission has, as a result, been relatively successful, and today the remains of 13 of the disappeared have been found, and the remains of 3 individuals, Joe Linsky, Columba McVeigh, and Robert Nerak, are yet to be found. As it notes on this slide, there are 2 other individuals who have disappeared in Northern Ireland in cases where paramilitary involvement is suspected. Gareth O'Connor went missing in 2003 and his remains were found in 2005. And Lisa Dorian disappeared in 2005 and has yet to be found. Loyalist paramilitaries are suspected to have been involved in her case. So I just, because the remit of the Independent Commission for the Location of Victims' Remains focuses on those killed before 10th of April 1998, so the date of the Good Friday Agreement, the cases of Lisa Dorian and Gareth O'Connor weren't covered in my research, but I just want to acknowledge them today. So as some of you will be aware, conflict textiles originated in Chile under the Pinochet dictatorship, and the disappearances in Chile and Northern Ireland differ in many ways. And an obvious one would be the scale, the number of disappearances. So numbers were a lot higher in Chile. In Chile, disappearances were perpetrated by agents of the state. And in Northern Ireland, as I mentioned, we had non-state armed groups. However, something that connects the relatives or connects both of these cases is that relatives of the disappeared were affected by the same form of harm and have faced some similar challenges. So one of these would be the silence and denial that follows a disappearance, and families starting from a position of not knowing what has happened. So Gabriel Gatti, in his book on disappearances in Uruguay and Argentina, talks about the disappeared as being this textbook case of uncertainty, and arguably this is something that connects relatives of the disappeared in many, many contexts. So in terms of the mobilisation by relatives, I've picked out a number of themes that I'm going to talk about today, which I think link the conflict textiles to mobilisation by families in the Northern Ireland context. So in a number of contexts, disappearances have created the impetus for mobilisation from below, often by relatives of the disappeared, sometimes supported by NGOs or local victims organisations. So in transitional justice contexts, families often mobilise in an effort to uncover the truth of what happened to their loved ones. As you can see in this quote on the left from Yusuf Kuvras's book on disappearances, he's described mobilisation as often being innovative, persistent, and international. So as a result of this, relatives of the disappeared can be examples of what Kieran McAvoy and Lorna McGregor describe as transitional justice from below, i.e. where you have those at the grassroots taking on the effort of trying to do transitional justice work. So conflict textiles are one example of this transitional justice work from below. So as I mentioned, their origins lie in Chile, where women would create these textiles as a way of challenging the violence and repression of Pinochet's dictatorship. Roberta Bacic has talked about how these textiles are mostly, in her words, written in the first person. So they're made by those directly impacted by conflict and authoritarianism. The families of Northern Ireland's disappeared are a further example of mobilisation from below. So it was their family members who were disappeared, and it was these families who first spoke out about the disappearances. In the image on the right on the slide, this is just one of the early newspaper headlines reporting the families' campaign from 1995. Since the mid-1990s, the families have campaigned for decades for the return of their loved ones' remains. And indeed, as remains have been recovered, families have continued to campaign for and support the families who are still waiting for their loved ones' remains to be found. And this brings me to the second theme. So Alan, if you could move forward a slide, please. So yes, my second theme is collective action. So both conflict textiles and the mobilisation of the families in Northern Ireland demonstrate the power of collective action. As I said previously, these textiles originated in Chile, and the women who made them would often come together in groups to make these textiles. So they are the result of collective action often. But many of the textiles also tell us something about collective action. So in the selection that's on display in the Ulster Museum as of today, the textile "Where Are the Disappeared" depicts a group of women protesting in front of the courts of justice. Can you move to the next slide, Alan, please? And this textile, "They Fell Like Stars from the Sky," shows the abuelas of the Plaza de Mayo standing in a circle, holding a vigil for the disappeared. So these conflict textiles are often a product of collective action, but they also provide us with like a record or an account of the types of collective mobilization that were taking place. And the next slide, please, Alan. So to bring us then to the Northern Ireland context. In the mid-1990s, the families of the disappeared began to become aware that there existed others who had shared similar experiences of their loved ones going missing. They began to work together to progress their campaign. They formed the Families of the Disappeared in 1995, and they became closely affiliated with WAVE, which is one of the biggest groups supporting victims and survivors of the conflict in Northern Ireland. As one of my interviewees described, the families became a small social movement. So in their book on social movements, Della Porta and Diani talk about how collective action can produce new identities. And through working together, the families of Northern Ireland's disappeared created a new collective identity for themselves. And this helped them to amplify their voice and ultimately to tell their stories, to tell people about what had happened to them. In addition, this allowed them to sort of restore identity to their loved ones through telling their stories. And I'll come back to this point later. So relatives of the disappeared have talked about the importance of that coming together, also in terms of the value of learning that they were not the only one in that position, and the importance of being able to support one another. So one of the sources that I will refer to a few times in this presentation is a book published by WAVE, which contains the accounts of families of the disappeared. In that book, John McClory's sister Eileen describes how hearing about other families made us feel not so alone. In an interview with me for my research, Kieran McGraw, whose brother Brendan was disappeared, spoke about the value for his mother of meeting other mothers of the disappeared and being able to sit with a group of people who understood how each other felt. So coming together as a collective helps the families to mobilize support externally, but it also is valuable in and of itself in terms of providing this source of support and comfort. Something that is a feature of the perpetration of disappearances across the world is power. So those who disappear have the power to take the person, detain them, often kill them, and the power to cover up what they've done afterwards. So collective action on the part of the relatives of the disappeared provides a way for families to reclaim some of that power and begin to challenge those who perpetrated disappearances. The next slide, please, Ellen. So the next theme that I want to pick out is that of breaking the silence that characterizes the aftermath of a disappearance. So silence permeates multiple levels of a disappearance. So individuals may be disappeared in an effort to silence them. Perpetrating disappearances might instill an atmosphere of terror that silences others. And in the aftermath of a disappearance, families are often met with silence for years or decades when they're trying to find out what happened to their loved ones. So the conflict textiles that originated under the Pinochet regime, they were being made in a context of silence and fear and repression. So the textiles provided a way for people to speak about what was going on, and therefore they were a mode of sort of challenging the silencing that the regime was trying to impose. Also, they provide a record of the ways that citizens tried to break the silence surrounding disappearance. So this textile is one of those that's on display in the Ulster Museum from today, leafleting in Santiago, and you can see here that it depicts people trying to pass leaflets of information about what the state is doing. Next slide, please, Ellen. And this textile, the lime kilns of Erlangen, is also on display in the museum. It depicts a group of women protesting. The case here relates to 15 men who were disappeared in 1973, and 5 years later, their bodies were found in a disused lime kiln in Longquen. And you can see in this textile, the women are protesting, and there's a line of police challenging the protesters. So this illustrates the context of state repression that relatives were trying to seek answers in. The next slide, please, Alan. Okay, so in Northern Ireland, the relatives of the disappeared here were also faced with silence in the aftermath of their loved ones going missing. It was only after the IRA ceasefires that it became safe for the families to speak out. So in the book that I mentioned, published by Wave, Margaret McKinney, whose son Brian was disappeared, describes how speaking out against the IRA during the conflict was taboo, and she was met with a wall of silence when she was trying to find out what had happened to her son. And it was only with the ceasefires that she was able to tell her story. Similarly, in 1994, Helen McKendry, whose mother Jean McConville was disappeared, was interviewed on the Talkback radio show, and she has said of this experience in a later newspaper interview that she was very frightened. People had known there were people who had disappeared, but they were too afraid to speak. And there's a number of statements from other relatives of the disappeared that make clear that during the conflict itself, it was not safe for them to speak out. So in the newspapers from the 70s and 80s, when the disappearances took place, you will find that some cases are reported there. So I've included a couple of examples on this slide. So widow with 10 children reported kidnapped refers to the case of Jean McConville, and this is taken from the Irish Times in January 1973. Jean McConville's abduction was also reported in the Irish News and the Belfast Telegraph. The missing persons notice relates to Brian McKinney and John McClory, and that was published in the Andersonstown News in June 1978, and there's other similar examples as well. So there were indications that people were going missing, but the picture was very incomplete during the conflict itself. So it wasn't until after the IRA ceasefires that we get more detailed accounts from the families, and it begins to emerge that these cases were connected. So it was at this time that the cases began to receive attention from the wider public and also from political figures. And this attention came because the families spoke out. Next slide, please, Ellen. So the penultimate theme that I want to touch on is international attention. So one of the purposes of conflict textiles was that they could be taken out of the country to draw attention to what was happening there. So Marjorie Agassiz has said about the Chilean arpilleras that the weaving is made for one purpose alone, to denounce and expose. And the impact of the textiles extended beyond Chile. So arpilleras were sent from Chile to spread news of what was happening there. And in this way, the textiles helped to bring international attention to the human rights abuses that were taking place in Chile. In the Northern Ireland context, the families became involved with the support of Wave, as I mentioned, in lobbying support at various levels, including local level and national level. But a key element of their campaign was seeking out international support. So the families wrote to President Bill Clinton, and in his Washington Investment Conference speech in 1995, Clinton referred to the plight of the families, saying it's time to allow families to be whole again. One of the human rights activists I interviewed for my research talked about how difficult it is to get included in something like that. So this shows the hard work on the part of the families in terms of strategizing and trying to mobilize support and planning their campaign. The image on the right of the slide is from 1998. So this is when Margaret McKinney, one of the mother of Brian McKinney, who was disappeared, met with Bill Clinton at the White House. And she said that it was after this meeting that things really began to happen in terms of action being taken with regards to the disappeared. So the attention of Bill Clinton was very significant for the family's campaign. So in both cases, this demonstrates the importance of bringing international attention onto disappearances. Can you move to the next slide, please, Alan? Okay, so the final theme I want to touch on is the importance or the power of sharing stories or sharing narratives of loss, as this is something that connects the textiles with the campaign of the families of the disappeared here. So with the arpilleras, Roberta has talked about how these textiles are testimonies. And you can see in the various textiles displayed at the Ulster Museum, and you can see if you look at the event on the Kane website, you can click on the links and look at all of the individual textiles there. But you can see in the textiles and the descriptions that come with them that they function as narratives, as testimonies. They tell us stories about the disappeared, and they can tell us about the efforts of those left behind to challenge the state and call out, try to find out the truth about what had happened to those who were disappeared. Something that was very key to the campaign of the families of the disappeared of Northern Ireland was sharing their stories. So they have told their stories to local and national media, for instance, and I've touched on a couple of examples of that today already. A further example is that prior to the House of Commons debate on the location of Victims' Remains Bill, a number of families travelled to the House of Commons to meet with MPs. After this visit, the MP Norman Godman, as you can see in the quote on the left of this slide, said, "I met Mrs. Margaret McKinney and another lady. If I had any doubts about the bill, they were dispelled when I met those two ladies." So because of the nature of the location of Victims' Remains Bill, as including this limited immunity, the debate on the bill in the House of Commons, there was a lot of focus on whether or not this bill constituted an amnesty for the IRA. And you can see here in this quote that this MP is saying that his own doubts about it were dispelled upon hearing from these women about their own experiences. More recently, we have published this book, which I've mentioned a couple of times in the presentation so far, and this contains accounts from relatives of the disappeared here. In this book, it's very powerful. So families talk about the disappearance, but they also talk about what their loved one was like, and they talk about what their family life was like when they were all still together. So the stories really serve to tell us something about who the disappeared were as people and about the impact of the disappearance on their family. So a number of researchers, such as Zoe Crossland, Emilio Krenzel and Gabrielle Gaddy, have written about disappearance as the removal or the attempted removal of identity. And through telling stories, the families could restore identity to their disappeared loved ones. To conclude then, as I mentioned, the remains of 13 of the 16 disappeared have now been recovered and returned to their families for burial. The Independent Commission for the Location of Victims' Remains continues to look for the 3 individuals who remain missing. The Commission has been relatively effective in its work, and it's an example of an effective transitional justice mechanism in the context of Northern Ireland, where the approach to transitional justice has been described as piecemeal, and we've yet to have like an overarching transitional justice mechanism to deal with the past. So the establishment of the Commission was the result of the mobilisation of the families and the efforts that they made. If families hadn't spoken out, the disappeared might still be unknown victims of the conflict here. So I think thinking about the campaign of the families in Northern Ireland and the RPRs, the conflict textiles, what they demonstrate are different ways that those at the grassroots, so those who have been most impacted by harm, can try to have their voices heard and try to mobilise support for their cause. Both cases show the importance of collective action, the need to break this silence that surrounds the act of disappearance, and they demonstrate the importance of sharing stories. And that's everything from me. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lauren, for really informative talk about what's happened in Northern Ireland, but it was also really interesting the way you linked that to the different textiles in the exhibition, giving it that international flavor. So I think that'll give us a lot of food for thought and discussion. I'm now going to turn to Dr. Rainer Huhle in Germany, who's an independent expert, or was an independent expert of the UN Committee on Enforced Disappearances between 2011 and 2019. He's also a member of the Coalition of Enforced Disappearances in Colombia. He's a lecturer on the Masters in Human Rights program at the University of Erlangen in Nürnberg. So brings a really rich international experience on the issue of enforced disappearance. And so you're very welcome, Raina, and I look forward to your response to Lauren, and then maybe us widening out the discussion, and we'll have some more time for questions. So thanks for joining us today, Raina.
Thanks so much, Brandon, and also Lauren, for this wonderful introduction to the problematic of enforced disappearance from the perspective of the victims and families and their organization. And thanks also to all the organizers of this event, one of many celebrated all over the world today. On this day, we record all the families, all the victims of enforced disappearance. I am certainly not entitled to go deeper into what Lauren told us about the situation in Ireland and the struggles of the families in Ireland against disappearances. As you might know, some explication for my relative ignorance of the problematic in this country is that neither the Republic of Ireland nor the United Kingdom, unfortunately, as today, are part of the International Convention on Enforced Disappearances, which is something, when I was in the committee, we always lamented. And personally, I really can't understand why these two democracies are unable or unwilling to join this important international convention, which so far, I think, in its first 10 years of existence has produced quite a lot of productive work. But anyway, from what I understand and from what Lauren just told us, it seems to me that the case of Ireland is extraordinary in several aspects, and Lauren mentioned some of them. 16 disappeared persons, 13 of them found. If I compare that with the record of almost all the other countries where we have disappearances, forced disappearances, this sounds excellent because it's a rate that is amazing. So there are 3 people still missing, still searched for, and families of these, and obviously, as we can see, not only the families, but the whole community is still looking for them, is searching them, is insisting that they be searched. So this again shows us that the struggle for knowing the truth, for knowing where they are and what happened to them, is a struggle that has no temporal limit. It goes on as long as the disappearance continues, which is one of the reasons why this crime of enforced disappearance in international law and in the national context too is considered a permanent crime, and therefore is not subject normally to prescription or to other ways of forgetting the crime. So in that sense, there are, of course, similarities in spite of the amazing difference in numbers. And let me briefly comment on some other important differences. As Lauren mentioned, the victims in the Northern Irish conflict are mainly victims of non-state actors, the rebellious Irish groups. So in strictly legal terms, they would not even fall under the definition of enforced disappearance, which requires that the state is either directly involved or indirectly by the authorization, the support, or the acquiescence of the state. Now, does this make a difference for the families? That's one of the questions I always have asked myself. And my answer over the years has become clearer and clearer. We cannot accept that this legal distinction, which I think is very important, and I will come back to that in a moment, that this legal distinction establishes a distinction between different groups of victims, and some of them might be more qualified to support or to aid than others. In spite of that, the insistence on the legal definition of enforced disappearances, that the state has to be implied, is important for victims to know, because it makes a difference whether it's your own state, your own police, your own military that kill or disappear you, or whether it is somebody without authorization, somebody who never pretended to be your protector, to be the guarantor of your civil rights, right? So it makes a difference, but the pain and the anguish still mostly is exactly the same. Anyway, under the convention, the International Convention on Enforced Disappearances, the state is obliged to investigate any kind of disappearance. Article 3 says it very clearly that if a disappearance is committed by non-state actors, the state has the same obligation to investigate, and I would add to repair the pain of the victims as if it had been the state itself. So that's a very important point, and I think it's kind of a progress in this convention in comparison to former events. And in the case of Ireland, I consider it a very precious article in that convention. And the same goes, of course, that the state or the society has to search for all disappeared persons and cannot make a discrimination because of the legal classification of the crime they fell victim. And one of the documents the committee has produced, and which was adopted by the United Nations in 2019, just a few weeks more than 2 years ago, the guiding principles on enforced disappearances are also very clear that these guiding principles for the search apply to all disappeared persons. This is the more important because today in some countries, and I'm thinking, for example, of Mexico, in a slightly different way also of Colombia, it's very hard to establish who is really responsible for disappearances. It's not just that we have the state on one side and we have some criminal or rebellious groups on the other side. There are so many shades that blur the distinction, and we really don't know who is the leading actor in these disappearances. This is one of the big challenges today for dealing with enforced disappearances. Or if you think of cases that we had in the committee, many cases from Iraq, which is really a member state of the convention, one of the few in the region. The state often said, well, that was not us, that was some militia from some oppositional movement. But then when you look closer, it turns out that who is today government and today opposition, perhaps 2 years ago, it was the other way around. The militia today is government, and who was then government is in the opposition. So it makes really no sense to insist on that distinction when we come to the problem of search. Now, one of the problems related to the difficulties of establishing the perpetrators and holding them accountable for the crimes is that families often turned to concentrate on the search. And that led in several countries to the establishment of independent, not from the state, but independent from the investigators, from the prosecutors, to independent institutions for the search of the missing, of the disappeared Now, this is a problem that resolves only in part the issues, the difficulties of searching for the disappeared. Anyway, I think we should keep in mind, just adding to what I said before, that international human rights law, as represented by the Convention, is not the only international law pertinent to to disappearances. Under international humanitarian law, or more precisely the Geneva Conventions, and also under international criminal law, like the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, war parties, like in the case of the Geneva Convention, then political groups, in the case also of the ICC, are held directly accountable for disappearances. And they are under the obligation by these instruments also to search for the people in modern peace accords, like, for example, the peace accord of Colombia 5 years ago. It was established that all the parties to this peace accord have to reveal all the information they have for the search and for finding the disappeared persons. It's a process that's still beginning. It's not produced dramatic results, but it has already produced more results than in other countries where this express will of the parties has not been established. And I think here again we have a bridge to the Irish situation that we might go deeper in our discussion later on. And in this context, it seems to me very important that the actors, be it the state, be it the non-state actors, acknowledge their responsibility and thus contribute to clarify what we call the fate and the whereabouts of the disappeared. This issue of acknowledgement is extremely important. Of course, it is the starting point for an effective search, but it is also a very important moral statement which in itself can contribute to reparation and healing of the wounds caused by the disappearances. I'm asking myself these days, what will happen one day in this respect? For example, in Afghanistan, will the new government, the new rulers acknowledge their disappearances, and will they be able to hold accountable the other actors that also killed and disappeared in Afghanistan? So I think peace accords should always include the obligation for all sides to clarify the fate and the whereabouts of the disappeared. Fate and whereabouts is a standard formula in all texts on enforced disappearances. And I think fate refers mostly to the search for the perpetrators, to the clarifying the circumstances, and the whereabouts, of course, refer to where are they, where are the people, the persons disappeared. Now, I think I want to comment briefly on another point that Lauren mentioned, and that is how families broke the silence, are breaking the silence in many parts, and are constructing forces, communal forces, joint forces to break that silence and to exercise pressure on governments to continue the search for the disappeared. I think it's a very important point that Lauren made, that in Northern Ireland, if I understood it correctly, this possibility for the families became real only after the peace accord or after the ceasefires. And before, there existed conditions that did not guarantee a minimum of safety for families, even to search And I might remember that one of the guiding principles we wrote in the Committee on Enforced Disappearances, Principle 14, spells out that the search must be carried out safely. That is, the state, the authorities must create safe conditions for the search, independently from the stage in which the search might just be. Which is, of course, difficult when the state is a perpetrator, and it is perhaps more difficult when the state has no control over non-state armed groups, but this does not diminish the obligation. In this context, it called always my attention that perhaps that the failure, the missing safety, has been one of the reasons that family quite often opt for giving priority to the search over the quest for justice. It's often called, they often speak, and also authorities often speak for the search as a humanitarian task, which of course it is. It can be a great humanitarian relief if you find somebody, of course. But the humanitarian in this sense is not the opposite of the legal obligation. The fact that it is a humanitarian act does not make it a voluntary act. It is a strict legal obligation in the same sense as the states are obliged to search for the perpetrators and bring them to justice. So if some of the family groups in many of the countries have been visiting or observing, give priority to the search over the quest for justice, it might also be a sign of certain resignation, that they feel that justice is unattainable. So let's at least look for our beloved family members who still are disappeared. But there is no unity, and I think the diversity of families and the diversity of their claims is something that we I as an outsider, an outstander, have always to respect. It's not, nobody can be judged over the priorities of families and their claims. And this diversity also sometimes makes it difficult for families and for collectives of victims to unite in their struggle. The examples that are mostly present in the exhibit, which come from the southern cone of South America, are probably examples where this kind of unity has been obtained to a large degree. But if we look to a case like Colombia, for example, where we have victims of enforced disappearances, not only from the state, but also from many non-state actors and from the rebellious groups, which have been highlighted now by the work of the Truth Commission in Colombia. We can imagine how difficult it is to find a common platform for all these victims groups. And I will never forget how emotionally, how big the emotional impact was for all the observers when during the peace negotiations in Havana, Cuba, delegations of altogether 60 representatives of families of disappeared went jointly to Havana to plea for the information on where the disappeared persons are. And these were families of missing soldiers and families of persons disappeared by the military or by paramilitary actors. And it was really difficult to get this process along. And it's always a fragile unity, but I think it's a precious unity that we should always try to support in every aspect. And let me finalize my brief comments on the last item that I noted now from Lauren's introduction, and that is the three persons that are still missing in Northern Ireland: Joe Linsky, Robert Nyrak, and Colombia McVie. And this reminds us again that the search for the missing and for the disappeared is continuing as long as persons are missing. It is continuing for the families because they will not give up. And it is continuing and must be continuous for the state because, again, as the convention sets it very clearly in different articles, and as we also stated it in Guiding Principles number 7, the search is a permanent obligation of the state. The state cannot close the case of enforced disappearance and just resign and say, well, I don't see any more chance, or I do not dedicate the necessary resources into something that is not so important for me. The state is obliged under international law to continue with the search, and I'm sure that will happen for the 3 persons still missing in Northern Ireland as well. Thank you so much, and congratulations to Lauren again.
Thank you, Rena, and for sharing your very wide international experience, and I think also putting a lot of the Northern Ireland situation into that wider context. It's really significant and I think very helpful. I am now going to turn to some questions, but I thought maybe before I do that, Lauren, is there anything you wanted to respond to, Rena? Because you did make a couple of comments. I don't know if there's anything you'd like to respond to. And
I guess I found Rena's comments interesting about this difference between humanitarian search and, prosecution, and the reasons why families might opt for search. I think as well, something about the Irish context that is perhaps different to some other contexts of disappearance is that the nature of the burials themselves, like these were individual graves, only a very small group of people, those involved in the disappearance, knew where they were. So I think in the Northern Irish context, without that limited immunity, there was no way that these bodies would have been found. So I think just listening to Rainer's comments, really, it struck me how context specific these problems are. I mean, I know obviously in my presentation, I was focusing on what connects these different cases, but I think that particular issue just sort of shows how context specific the challenges can be and how you need a response that works and is practical in that specific context. But otherwise, yeah, just thank you, Rainer, for all of your comments. It was really interesting and really useful to get that international perspective.
Okay, well, thank you again to both of you for really interesting presentations. I have one question here, which came to me in a private, in one of the private messages rather than to everyone, but I'll read it out. It's from RMP, so I'm not quite sure who that is, but their question, I think initially was posed to Lauren, but I think it would apply equally to Rainer. And essentially the question is really about how does one verify information? So in many cases, this person says, the victims have a hunch that someone has been disappeared, but they don't necessarily know that somebody has been disappeared. I know in Northern Ireland it's slightly different because groups claimed responsibility for it. So this person was curious as how do you make an appropriate discernment, if any, or maybe stating it a bit more strongly, how do researchers determine when an allegation of disappearance is legitimate as opposed to what they said here is false? So how is that that sort of determination made? I mean, maybe Raina, you've seen that quite a lot. I don't know if Lauren, you want to comment about that in Northern Ireland, which is again, I think, slightly different.
I mean, obviously from the Northern Ireland case, I haven't got a huge amount to say on that specific query. We had a different setup here where perpetrators brought information forward on the basis of this immunity. The one thing I would say is that when Jeff Knupfer, who's now the senior investigator, was brought in, I think in the early 2000s to look at the process and write a report. After that, they introduced a very specific process for locating remains involving a lot of desk-based research prior to going into the field. So there is a lot of work that goes into that, but in terms of verifying specific information, I imagine that's something Renner could speak to better than me.
Renner?
Yeah, that's a very interesting, important question. And it's one of the statements we hear all too often from authorities. And there's a standard answer from police or other competent authorities when they're asked to look for disappeared persons. Well, first of all, let's wait at least 3 days and probably he will come back, he or she or whoever. Probably that is he went with his girlfriend, or he was involved in a struggle with his friends and went away in hiding, something like that. Of course, that happens. Unfortunately, in my country, at least 99 and more % of people declared missing to some police appear sooner or later. But that's not the case where we have large-scale patterns of disappearances, like in countries like Mexico, Colombia today, just to mention those where we have at least existing authorities capable of searching. So there's a very clear standard in international human rights law, and the committee has always reinforced it in all its recommendations to every single state, that in case of doubt you have to search. If it turns out that the person was not forcefully disappeared, or was not disappeared by any criminal organization, and returns, well, you wasted some energy and some time, but this is better than to waste the life of a person, obviously. And if the announcement was made in bad faith, well, that is a crime, or at least, I don't know the correct English term, an offense, and it can be punished. But again, it must not be a pretext not to search. And especially this 70 hours rule, that is an informal rule applied by so many police in so many countries, is one of the obstacles that impedes us to find people, because the first hours, the first day, the first results of immediate investigation give the best possibility to find the person. So we have been struggling hardly against these policies of doubting the fact that a person was disappeared involuntarily. In case of doubt, always you have to search.
Thank you, Rena, and again for drawing on that wide experience. I have what essentially is a comment here, and it links to what we're talking about, and the comment is from Sherry Eppel, who is a good friend and a colleague of Conflict Textiles and all of us, and actually presented last year at Following the Footsteps seminar, and also has a piece in the current exhibition. And she writes, I think in many countries, justice is not an option as the perpetrators remain in power and remain ruthless. And the fear can be that if the state carries out its obligations to recover, they will not do so in a way that respects forensic best practice, and may in fact prefer to conduct the kinds of recoveries that destroy bones and evidence and fate and identity. And I think Sherry's talking very much from her experience in in Zimbabwe. So it's more of a comment really than a question, but I don't know if there was you wanted to respond to that either, Raina or Lauren, and I don't know if there are other questions if people would like to put those in.
Well, if I may, again, there are pretty clear rules for forensic investigation, and there must be the same for criminal investigation and for the search. In fact, we have made a study recently on the interaction between criminal investigation forensics and forensic methods applied by search institutions, and they must converge because bad forensic procedures may always destroy elements not only for the search or for the investigation, but for both. So one of the requisites is really that they work hand in hand. Now, if in a state there is no chance to investigate a crime because the powerful who might be responsible for the disappearances are still in government, then of course these chances are very limited. And well, mostly then there is also no search either, because of course the authorities, the bodies doing the research know that searching for the person might always produce also indices for finally identifying the authors of the crime, because they are not totally independent. But this, of course, depends very much on situations in each country, and there are only rough guidelines for that to handle. And again, as I said before, the families, the victims, should always have a say in setting their priorities in that, which does not mean that as a society or as a world community of human rights, we would resign to maintaining the principle of justice. We will not give up that for pragmatic reasons, but one should understand that under certain circumstances, one must go step by step and be a bit pragmatic. But we have also seen situations where after many years, remnants or elements of identification or other elements of proof have become valuable and important for trials when nobody even thought of it. But because of lawyers, because of scientists had preserved those elements, decades later it was possible to try the perpetrators. Chile is a very good example for that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Renat. That's very helpful again. I have a question here from Magdalena Weiner, which I think is an important question. And I know, Lauren, you've also written a little bit about this, but her question is, it struck me how the presentations and the activity, particularly the role of women in the struggle, creating up the eras, going on searches, protesting in public, which I also know particularly from the Mexican context, Magdalena writes. I was wondering if there's any research done about the connection of women's roles within this, from the textile practices through to policies and campaigning, and if this is also something we have seen in Northern Ireland. She sort of then adds, if there's any research, what results have come from it? Does this reflect on the structures within society? So it's really about the role of women, and we know that it is a very, I don't know, certainly from my perspective, whenever you think of activism around disappearances, it is often women who are at the forefront of that. So I don't know if you want to comment on that, Lauren.
Yes, definitely, Brandon. So in terms of the first part of the question around the role of women in these textiles, this is an area that I'm just getting into, but I'll happily share references with the questioner if she wants to get in touch. In the Northern Ireland, as you say, Brandon, I mean, internationally, when we think of mobilisation around disappearances, we think of women. You know, we think of the Madres and the Abuelas in Buenos Aires, and protests very much being led by women. In the Northern Ireland context, certainly in when the family started campaigning back in the late 1990s, in interviews from the time, it was relatively often the mothers, the women who we saw speak. But I think years ago, actually, we met with a delegation of people involved in searching for the disappeared of Chile, and they did remind us that, you know, men are left behind too. You know, there's brothers and husbands, and men are part of the picture as well. But it is certainly something that is often associated with women. And I think as well, one of the key themes, I think in contexts where victims and victimhood can be politicized, and disappearances often, you know, can be politicized as well, there is a common theme of, you know, focusing on the maternal connection, the link between mother and child, and that's something that very much helps to humanize victims, and I think helps us to understand the suffering of those left behind. So yeah, in my view, this role of the mother, this idea of the mother, is often quite central in mobilisation. And yes, whilst women are very much central, I think obviously men are a feature as well, and particularly in Northern Ireland, where the mothers of those who were disappeared, many of them have passed away in recent years. You know, you see sons coming to the fore in terms of being more involved in giving media interviews and that sort of thing. So it's something that changes over time. But yes, certainly women do seem to feature quite centrally.
No, may I briefly comment on that topic too, because as a male, of course, it touches me too. And it is a tricky question. Why are women so prominent in the defense of the rights of the disappeared and in the search for the beloved family members? I think a very, very simple reason is that the great majority of the disappeared so far have been fathers and husbands. So it is the remaining wives and mothers that are searching primarily, but there's also a kind of strategic scheme behind that. You can see that very clearly in Argentina. The mothers went to the forefront because everybody assumed, mostly rightfully, but not entirely, that they were less probably an object of aggression of the authorities. It is harder for the male-oriented armed forces to attack women than to attack men. But there's also an association in Argentina called Padres de Plaza de Mayo, Fathers of the Plaza de Mayo, who work mostly behind the scenes, supporting the mothers, etc. So it is not such a clear-cut picture as it is often painted.
Thanks, Rena. That is helpful. Did you want to try now, Roberto?
Yeah. What happened very much in Chile is that it was mainly the men who had disappeared. So it was the women who had to take the role of, on the one hand, take the responsibilities at home, but it was their decision to have and be able to go to look into the detention centers and associate. And as Rainer said, it was also a bit less dangerous to be a woman, because there is this role that women should be at home and they are not harmful. So also the military were a bit less ruthless at the beginning. I wouldn't say that it happened with all cases, but the majority of the women who engaged was also because it was mostly men, the ones who had disappeared. So it's they stayed on their own without the men, the husband, the friends, the children, the sons.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Roberta, and that's obviously very nice to hear from you at the museum as well. So thanks very much. Because there's another question here from Mairead Collins, a friend of ours and colleague, and And I think it also links actually a bit to, you mentioned this as well, Raina, the sort of the way some families might want the sort of humanitarian, find the truth process, and some might want justice, and the gaps between that. But Mairead says, Lauren, of the group of families that mobilized in Ireland, was there a long journey for them to see themselves as one movement? Were there hurdles of differences of views of justice and expectation of the movement to overcome before they could work as one?
Yes, so I'll preface my response, I guess, by saying that no group of victims is a monolith. Obviously, you know, those who've been impacted by harm, there will be differences amongst families and potentially differences within families. From my own research, like from the earliest reports of the 90s, the families seemed very sort of all in line with this message that they wanted the remains returned, and they were not focused on prosecution, that the priority was getting remains returned. In more recent years, I think some of Jean McConville's children have spoken about a desire for prosecution, but again, her case is slightly different. And yeah, and overall, I think the families have stayed cohesive on this message that their priority is recovering remains without prosecution. Occasionally, there's been news reports of certain family members, you know, being frustrated, like this compromise was made, this limited immunity was supported, and it hasn't resulted in remains being found in all cases. But overall, from at least from what I've seen, they've been quite cohesive as a group.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And Raina, I know you mentioned that in your presentation. Is there anything you wanted to add from the international perspective?
No, I think the Irish case, as Lauren described it, is quite representative. There is no common thread in the demands of victims' organizations or families about the issues of finding and searching and finding the disappeared, and asking for bringing the perpetrators to justice. That varies inside of different collectives of groups, that varies even over time in a single person, the priorities they have depending on the changing circumstances. And it has much to do also with the former life and the afterlife of the person, of the family member, of the victim. They are so different. In Peru, for example, a great part of the victims of enforced disappearance were people who had never had to do anything with politics. That was, of course, quite different in Chile or in Argentina. And if you were a militant in politics, you're probably more inclined to ask for justice because you have a sense of justice. If you have never had a chance before to think about what is the obligations of your government, what is the sense of the rule of law, then you might be more distant towards and more close to your immediate need of reuniting with the disappeared person. So there are so many circumstances that define that we cannot and we should not generalize on this topic.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you. I think that's a helpful reminder, and that's also where Lauren started, that, you know, these groups are not necessarily homogeneous, and that's important because it also represents a diversity of views and perspectives. So thanks. I guess what's really interesting about this new format, not so new anymore, of Zoom, is we have a comment here from Rosa Boras, who is joining us from Puebla in Mexico. And she says there's a very active, growing collective called Voz de los Desaparecidos en el Puebla. Besides organizing for the search, they have pushed for the approval of a new law, the State of Puebla Disappearances Law. They worked with human rights defenders, lawyers, and different groups. Although the governor refused to work with the families and ignored their work, a law was just approved, and it's a great first step to enforcing the law and the recognition of the problem of the Mexican state. And then she went on to add that this also had a lot of transitional justice principles built into it. So it's a little bit more of a comment, but I might turn it into a question, maybe to Raina, and Lauren, you can comment as well. Reina, you've been around a long time working on this field, and there's more and more laws come in and more policies, I suppose, on this issue. Do you think in the case of where Rosa there talks about this new law, has this made a difference globally in terms of the issue of disappearances? The more statutory and legal requirements that are in place?
Well, first of all, bienvenida, Rosa, to this meeting. And actually, Mexico is fascinating in the sense that it is full now of collectives of families searching for their beloved members, missing, disappeared under different circumstances. There's almost no state left where disappearances, no Mexican state left where disappearances occur without these collectives. They have quite a history already in the country. And yes, of course, it's fascinating to observe how from a very clear beginning of searching, and they go to the mountains and search by themselves because the authorities don't do their work. But now, over the years, I have seen, I don't know the case of Puebla precisely, but in Veracruz and in other parts of the country, there has been an approachment now between these collectives and at least some prosecutors of goodwill who go and they go together, because families often have more information than the prosecutor. And so if there's goodwill on both sides, this can be a very productive relationship to. And yes, they have also pressed for and participated in the drafting of the big law on enforced disappearances, which Mexico has now for, I think, 3 or 4 years. The committee has also pressed for it. And now the same struggle is going on in the different federal states of Mexico. So this is really something I think we should closely look at, because it might be exemplary for other states too, this kind of not easy and not, it's not a relationship without conflicts, of course, and there are new conflicts breaking up almost every day between the groups and the authorities. But if you don't even try to find a prosecutor or any civil servant of goodwill, you will never reach it. You must try, and you will. And my experience is that almost everywhere you find somebody whom you can to relate, and then you have to try how to go on.
Thanks, Rena. Again, I mean, a really rich answer, just talking to your experience, and it also sort of struck me when you mentioned there this idea of the collectives developing in a range of different places, that to some degree, Lauren, that really links with you talking about the idea of sort of transitional justice from below. And I don't know if there's anything you wanted to comment on that, or leave it at that.
No, there's nothing particularly I want to add. I mean, other than I think the example that Rosa gave just demonstrates again how, responses need to respond to the challenges of a specific context, and the situation in Mexico is so hugely complex that it's good to see that these processes are emerging and driven by those most affected by the harm.
Okay, I might then bring us to a close just with a traditional round of thank yous. Thank you very much, Lauren, for a really sort of structured, clear presentation, making those international links, informing us more about the Northern Ireland case. I found it really helpful, so thanks for that. And Reina, thank you for that international contextualization. I could have fired 100 questions at you. Maybe I'll save that for another time. It feels like there's so much that you have that you can share with us. So just to really thank you very much for that. And of course, to really thank Roberta Batchik, who is the curator of Conflict Textiles, who in many ways makes all of this happen, with Gillian Robinson and Briege Doherty working with her. and of course Karen Logan, who works at the Ulster Museum and has been instrumental in the new exhibition. I put up a link for that. Just thank you to all of them. Roberta had also just sent me a note asking me to just thank everybody on the team's behalf, and so I would like to do that. So thank you everybody for being part of the seminar today, for also engaging in what's a really difficult subject, I think, to talk about in this type of a forum. It's hard enough face to face and in this type of a forum. And so Roberta wanted to really just thank you all for engaging in this subject. We also know many of you. I can see through the names, many of you are activists working in this area, working against the odds. And Roberta also wanted to thank you for that ongoing transitional justice struggle that many of you are engaged in. So I think I might leave it at that. And finally, just to thank all of you today for joining us. I think it was a fantastic seminar, really rich, and we look forward to seeing you again, hopefully in person. And please do visit the link to the Ulster Museum website and follow Conflict Textiles for further events. So thank you very much.